Welcome to Global Blueprint, a go-to channel for politics, economics, and global affairs. The disappearance of intellectuals in the age of neoliberalism. Historical context and the decline of intellectualism. Intellectualism, historically understood as the pursuit and application of knowledge through critical thinking, has long served as a cornerstone of societal progress. Rooted in philosophical traditions that emphasize reason, inquiry, and the dissemination of ideas, intellectualism has significantly contributed to advancements in science, governance, education, and public discourse. From the Enlightenment period to the mid-20th century, intellectuals played pivotal roles in shaping modern democracies by fostering dialogue on ethical, social, and political issues. Universities, libraries, and salons became hubs for intellectual activity, nurturing debates that influenced policymaking and cultural norms. However, this tradition of intellectualism has faced significant challenges since the advent of neoliberalism, a shift that warrants careful examination. Neoliberalism emerged as a dominant economic and political ideology in the aftermath of World War II, gaining prominence in the late 20th century under leaders such as Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States. At its core, neoliberalism prioritizes free markets, deregulation, privatization, and individual responsibility over collective welfare. While initially framed as a means to promote efficiency and economic growth, neoliberal policies have profoundly reshaped societal values, often marginalizing pursuits deemed non-essential to market-driven outcomes. The ascendancy of neoliberalism has led to a recalibration of societal priorities, with profound implications for intellectualism. As governments and institutions increasingly adopt market-oriented principles, there has been a noticeable devaluation of intellectual pursuits that do not yield immediate practical benefits. For instance, fields like philosophy, literature, and theoretical sciences, once celebrated for their contributions to human understanding, are now often viewed skeptically when contrasted against disciplines like engineering, finance, or business management, which promise direct economic returns. This paradigm shift reflects a broader trend wherein intrinsic value is subordinated to instrumentalist criteria, leading to what some scholars describe as the commodification of knowledge. Universities, traditionally bastions of intellectualism, exemplify how neoliberal pressures have altered institutional priorities. Over recent decades, higher education systems worldwide have undergone significant transformations driven by funding cuts, tuition hikes, and an emphasis on vocational training aligned with labor market demands. The corporatization of universities has resulted in administrative bloat, standardized curricula, and a focus on rankings and revenue generation rather than fostering critical thought. Faculty members face mounting pressure to secure external funding for research projects with tangible applications, leaving little room for speculative or foundational inquiries. Moreover, students are increasingly encouraged to pursue degrees perceived as pathways to lucrative careers, further eroding support for humanities and liberal arts programs. Media organizations, another vital arena for intellectual engagement, have similarly experienced the corrosive effects of neoliberalism. In an era dominated by digital platforms and algorithm-driven content distribution, media outlets prioritize sensationalism, clickbait headlines, and entertainment over nuanced analysis and investigative journalism. This trend not only diminishes opportunities for meaningful public discourse, but also exacerbates polarization by catering to fragmented audiences seeking affirmation rather than enlightenment. Furthermore, the consolidation of media ownership into fewer corporate hands limits diversity of perspectives, undermining the role of journalism as a watchdog and facilitator of informed citizenship. The consequences of these shifts extend beyond academia and media, permeating broader cultural attitudes towards intellectualism. Public figures who engage in abstract reasoning or advocate for systemic change are frequently dismissed as elitist or out of touch, reflecting a growing disdain for expertise and evidence-based arguments. This phenomenon has been exacerbated by populist movements that exploit anti-intellectual sentiments to challenge established institutions and narratives. Such dynamics highlight the need for deeper exploration into specific mechanisms driving the decline of intellectualism within neoliberal societies. Understanding these changes requires examining not only macro-level ideological shifts, but also micro-level practices that reinforce them. Future research should delve into the interplay between neoliberal policies and cultural attitudes, identifying strategies to revitalize intellectualism amidst contemporary challenges.
Section 2. Economic Pressures and the Commodification of Knowledge. In recent decades, the neoliberal economic paradigm has significantly reshaped societal structures, including the realms of education and research. One of the most profound transformations under this framework is the commodification of knowledge, where intellectual endeavors are increasingly treated as marketable products rather than public goods. This shift reflects a broader ideological movement that prioritizes privatization, deregulation, and the primacy of market forces in shaping social institutions. Within academia, this trend manifests in the transformation of universities into profit-driven entities, with education and research redefined as commodities to be bought and sold. The implications of this phenomenon are far-reaching, affecting not only the production and dissemination of knowledge, but also the very ethos of intellectual inquiry. A critical driver of the commodification of knowledge is the systematic reduction in public funding for higher education institutions. Over the past several decades, many governments have implemented austerity measures that have led to significant budget cuts for public universities. These financial pressures have forced institutions to adopt more entrepreneurial models, relying heavily on tuition fees, private donations, and corporate partnerships to sustain operations. As a result, the traditional mission of universities, to foster intellectual exploration and serve the public good, has been supplanted by a vocational orientation. Programs that align closely with labor market demands, such as business, engineering, and technology, receive disproportionate attention and resources, while disciplines rooted in the humanities and pure sciences face marginalization. This vocational turn not only narrows the scope of academic inquiry, but also reinforces socioeconomic inequalities, as access to higher education becomes increasingly contingent upon an individual's ability to pay. The influence of corporate sponsorship on academic research further exacerbates the commodification of knowledge. In an era of dwindling public funds, universities have become increasingly reliant on external funding sources, including grants from private corporations. While such partnerships can provide much-needed financial support, they often come at a cost to academic independence. Corporate sponsors frequently dictate the direction and scope of research projects, prioritizing areas that align with their commercial interests. For instance, pharmaceutical companies may fund studies that emphasize the efficacy of their products while downplaying potential risks or side effects. Similarly, tech giants investing in artificial intelligence research may steer investigations towards applications that enhance their competitive advantage rather than addressing broader societal concerns. These dynamics create inherent conflicts of interest, undermining the integrity of scholarly work and eroding trust in the scientific enterprise. Beyond institutional changes, the commodification of knowledge imposes significant psychological burdens on intellectuals and researchers. Scholars are increasingly pressured to align their work with market demands, producing research that yields immediate economic returns rather than contributing to long-term intellectual progress. This pressure is particularly acute in fields where funding is scarce or highly competitive. Researchers may find themselves compelled to pursue trendy topics or methodologies that appeal to grant reviewers, even if these diverge from their true interests or expertise. These constraints stifle creativity and autonomy, leading to a homogenization of ideas and a decline in innovative thinking. Moreover, the emphasis on measurable outcomes, such as publication counts, citation metrics, and patent filings, further exacerbates this trend, incentivizing quantity over quality and short-term gains over sustained inquiry. The cultural ramifications of these economic trends extend beyond academia, influencing how society values and engages with knowledge. As education and research become increasingly commodified, there is a growing tendency to view them through the lens of utility and profitability. This perspective devalues forms of knowledge that do not yield direct economic benefits, such as philosophical reflection, artistic expression, and historical analysis. It also fosters a transactional relationship between individuals and educational institutions, wherein students are seen as consumers purchasing credentials rather than learners seeking personal and intellectual growth. Furthermore, the privileging of market logic in knowledge production reinforces existing power structures, concentrating intellectual authority in the hands of those who control financial resources. This concentration limits diversity of thought and perpetuates systemic inequities, as marginalized voices struggle to gain recognition within a system that prioritizes economic capital over epistemic justice. Addressing these issues requires a multifaceted approach that includes restoring public funding for higher education, establishing safeguards against corporate influence, and reimagining the role of academia in fostering a more equitable and enlightened society. Future research should explore alternative models of knowledge production that prioritize collective well-being over individual profit, ensuring that the pursuit of truth remains a shared endeavor rather than a privatized privilege.
Section 3. The role of media and technology in shaping anti-intellectual sentiment. The interplay between media, technology, and public perception has fundamentally altered the landscape of intellectual discourse, fostering an environment where anti-intellectual sentiment is increasingly normalized and amplified. This transformation is not merely a byproduct of digital culture, but a systemic outcome of how information is produced, consumed, and validated in the modern era. The central mechanism driving this shift lies in the structural incentives embedded within digital platforms, particularly social media ecosystems, that prioritize engagement over accuracy, sensationalism over nuance, and speed over depth. These dynamics create fertile ground for distrust in expertise as users are repeatedly exposed to emotionally charged content that undermines complex reasoning in favor of simplistic narratives. Digital platforms have reconfigured the very architecture of information consumption. Algorithms designed to maximize user retention, often through personalized feeds and recommendation engines, favor content that elicits strong emotional responses, such as outrage or fear, over content requiring sustained cognitive effort. This algorithmic bias toward affective stimulation results in what scholars term attention economies, where the value of information is measured not by its veracity, but by its capacity to capture fleeting attention spans. For instance, studies show that posts containing misinformation or inflammatory claims receive significantly more shares than fact-based articles, even when the latter are authored by credible experts. Such disparities reinforce a feedback loop, wherein users internalize the belief that emotionally resonant content represents truth, thereby devaluing evidence-based arguments from academic or professional sources. This phenomenon is particularly pronounced in polarized political environments, where platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been shown to amplify conspiracy theories and fringe ideologies, often at the expense of mainstream scientific consensus. Closely related to this trend is the rise of clickbait culture, which further erodes deep reading and critical thinking skills among users. Clickbait headlines, characterized by hyperbole, ambiguity, and promise of revelation, are engineered to provoke curiosity while offering minimal substantive value. A 2024 study by Daniotti et al. Demonstrated that AI-assisted coding tools increased developer productivity by up to 2.4% per quarter, yet this same efficiency gain did not translate into improved analytical rigor. Instead, it enabled faster output without deeper reflection, a parallel that applies broadly across knowledge domains. In educational settings, students exposed to clickbait-style content exhibit reduced comprehension levels and lower retention rates compared to those engaging with structured, long-form material. This degradation of reading habits contributes directly to anti-intellectualism, as individuals come to associate learning with effort rather than reward, leading them to reject scholarly authority altogether. Moreover, generative AI tools used in writing and research may inadvertently encourage surface-level engagement if users rely on automated summaries without verifying source credibility, a risk underscored by the growing prevalence of AI-generated disinformation campaigns targeting journalists, educators, and policymakers. A critical driver of anti-expert sentiment is the weaponization of populist rhetoric within online echo chambers. Social media platforms facilitate the formation of ideologically homogeneous communities where dissenting views are filtered out, reinforcing group identity and validating pre-existing beliefs. Within these spaces, experts, especially those affiliated with institutions perceived as elitist or politically biased, are routinely dismissed as untrustworthy or self-serving. Research indicates that exposure to such echo chambers correlates strongly with skepticism toward public health authorities, climate scientists, and economists during crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, during early stages of the pandemic, prominent figures on YouTube and TikTok disseminated unverified treatments and conspiracy theories about vaccine ingredients, leading to widespread vaccine hesitancy despite overwhelming scientific consensus. Similarly, during the 2020 U.S. presidential election, misinformation spread rapidly through Facebook groups and WhatsApp chains, contributing to voter confusion and undermining trust in electoral integrity. These events illustrate how digital infrastructure can be exploited to delegitimize expertise, transforming informed debate into performative opposition.
Case studies from major societal events provide concrete evidence of this erosion of trust in expertise. During the global response to the pandemic, governments faced unprecedented challenges in communicating risk due to the rapid proliferation of false information online. In the United States, for instance, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, experienced declining public confidence after being portrayed as politically aligned with the administration, even though their guidance was based on peer-reviewed science. This narrative was amplified by influencers who gained large followings by questioning expert advice, often citing anecdotal evidence or pseudoscientific claims. Similar patterns emerged in India and Brazil, where leaders publicly contradicted epidemiologists, leading to policy paralysis and preventable loss of life. Another notable case occurred during the 2024 U.S. presidential debates, where candidates frequently attacked academic institutions and think tanks, labeling them as deep state actors.
These attacks were widely shared across platforms, creating a cultural norm where intellectual authority is viewed as suspect unless it aligns with one's political worldview. It is important to acknowledge counterarguments, suggesting that technology democratizes access to knowledge, potentially countering anti-intellectual trends. Indeed, open-access journals, MOOCs, massive online open courses, and citizen science initiatives have expanded opportunities for lifelong learning and skill development. Platforms like Coursera and edX offer courses from top universities, enabling millions globally to engage with high-quality educational content. Furthermore, AI-driven tools such as language models and tutoring systems personalize learning experiences, making complex subjects more accessible to diverse audiences. However, these benefits are unevenly distributed and often overshadowed by the broader structural issues outlined above. As noted by Bick et al., while nearly 40% of the U.S. population aged 18 to 64 uses generative AI, only 23% of employed respondents use it for work weekly, a disparity indicating that access does not equate to meaningful engagement. Additionally, the lack of digital literacy among many users means they are ill-equipped to distinguish between authoritative and misleading content, rendering democratized access ineffective in curbing misinformation. Thus, while technology holds potential to empower citizens, its current implementation risks entrenching epistemic inequality rather than resolving it. To mitigate this, stakeholders, including platform designers, educators, and policymakers, must implement strategies that prioritize transparency, accountability, and critical media literacy. Future research should focus on evaluating the effectiveness of interventions such as algorithmic audits, fact-checking partnerships, and mandatory digital education curricula in schools. Only through deliberate, multi-sectoral efforts can societies reclaim the democratic potential of technology while safeguarding the foundations of informed civic life.
Section 4. The influence of neoliberal policies on the role and agency of public intellectuals. Public intellectuals have historically played a pivotal role in fostering civic engagement, challenging entrenched power structures, and promoting informed debate within democratic societies. Their contributions extend beyond academia, as they engage with broader societal issues, offering critiques and alternative perspectives that enrich public discourse. However, the ascendancy of neoliberal policies over recent decades has significantly reshaped the landscape in which public intellectuals operate, often undermining their capacity to fulfill these roles effectively. This section examines the multifaceted impact of neoliberalism on public intellectuals, focusing on the erosion of institutional support, the marginalization of dissenting voices, and the global dimensions of this phenomenon. Neoliberal policies, characterized by privatization, deregulation, and the retreat of the state from public life, have systematically curtailed spaces for intellectual dissent. One of the most pronounced effects has been the defunding and corporatization of institutions that traditionally supported intellectual activity, such as universities, research centers, and cultural organizations. As public funding for these institutions dwindles, they increasingly rely on private donors and corporate sponsorship, which often come with implicit or explicit expectations of ideological alignment. For instance, the rise of corporate-funded think tanks has shifted the focus of intellectual inquiry toward market-friendly solutions, sidelining critical perspectives that challenge neoliberal orthodoxy. This trend not only narrows the scope of intellectual engagement, but also creates an environment where dissenting voices are systematically marginalized. Specific instances of censorship, defunding, and marginalization underscore the challenges faced by intellectuals who critique neoliberal practices. In several countries, scholars and activists advocating for social justice, environmental sustainability, or economic equality have encountered significant pushback. For instance, academics in the United States have reported facing pressure to align their research with corporate interests or risk losing funding opportunities.
Similarly, in Latin America, intellectuals critical of neoliberal reforms have been subjected to political repression, media blackouts, and even violence. These examples highlight the ways in which neoliberal policies can suppress intellectual diversity and stifle the free exchange of ideas, thereby undermining the foundational principles of democratic societies. The global dimension of this issue reveals strikingly similar patterns across different countries under neoliberal regimes. In Europe, austerity measures imposed during the financial crises of the late 2000s led to severe cuts in public education and research budgets, disproportionately affecting humanities and social sciences. Meanwhile, in Africa and Asia, structural adjustment programs promoted by international financial institutions have often resulted in the dismantling of public institutions, further eroding the infrastructure necessary for intellectual flourishing. Despite regional variations, the overarching trend is one of convergence. Neoliberal policies tend to prioritize market logic over public interest, leaving little room for intellectual pursuits that do not generate immediate economic returns. Reflecting on these developments, it becomes evident that the erosion of spaces for intellectual dissent poses significant risks to democratic societies reliant on informed debate. Public intellectuals serve as vital intermediaries between academic knowledge and public policy, helping citizens navigate complex issues and hold power accountable. When their voices are silenced or co-opted, the quality of public discourse suffers, leading to a decline in civic engagement and a weakening of democratic institutions. To address this challenge, it is imperative to re-evaluate the priorities embedded within neoliberal frameworks and advocate for policies that safeguard the autonomy and integrity of intellectual endeavors. Further research into alternative models of governance and funding could provide valuable insights into how to create more inclusive and equitable environments for intellectual activity. Ultimately, the resilience of democratic societies depends on their ability to nurture and sustain the vibrant intellectual ecosystems upon which they rely.
Section 5. Cultural shifts toward individualism and consumerism. Implications for intellectual engagement and societal cohesion. The transition from collectivist to hyper-individualistic cultural frameworks, particularly within the context of neoliberal economic policies, has profoundly reshaped societal values, priorities, and modes of engagement. This transformation is not merely a sociological observation, but a systemic reconfiguration of how individuals relate to one another, to institutions, and to knowledge itself. At its core, this shift emphasizes personal autonomy, self-actualization, and market-driven success over communal well-being, shared responsibility, and intellectual discourse. Neoliberal ideology, rooted in deregulation, privatization, and the commodification of social goods, has institutionalized individual choice as the primary metric of value, effectively marginalizing collective action and long-term civic investment in favor of short-term personal gain. For example, public education systems have increasingly been reframed as private investments rather than public goods, reinforcing the notion that academic achievement should be pursued primarily for career advancement, rather than for its intrinsic contribution to democratic citizenship or scientific progress. This ideological pivot aligns with broader global trends where GDP growth, consumer spending, and individual wealth accumulation are prioritized over equitable access to healthcare, environmental sustainability, or educational equity, a dynamic that directly undermines the conditions necessary for sustained intellectual development across populations. This individualistic ethos has further entrenched consumerist ideals as dominant cultural narratives, wherein material success becomes synonymous with personal worth and social status. As argued by scholars such as Jean Baudrillard and Guy Debord,
Contemporary societies have moved beyond mere consumption toward what they term hyper-reality, where symbolic value derived from branding, lifestyle aesthetics, and digital visibility supersedes actual utility or meaning. In this framework, intellectual pursuits such as critical thinking, scholarly inquiry, or ethical reflection are often devalued when they do not yield immediate financial returns or social capital. The result is an anti-intellectual bias that manifests in multiple domains: political discourse, media representation, and even public health responses. For instance, during the early stages of the pandemic, misinformation spread rapidly because many individuals rejected expert advice in favor of anecdotal evidence or celebrity-endorsed alternatives, illustrating how consumerist logic, that is, choosing the most appealing narrative, can override rational, evidence-based reasoning. Such dynamics are reinforced by algorithmic curation on social platforms that reward sensationalism over substance, thereby creating feedback loops where emotional resonance trumps analytical depth, an outcome that disproportionately affects younger generations who rely heavily on digital media for information. Entertainment industries play a pivotal role in amplifying these trends by elevating celebrity culture at the expense of intellectual figures. While historically, intellectuals like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, or Simone de Beauvoir were widely respected for their contributions to science, philosophy, and politics, today's media landscape favors influencers, athletes, and performers whose appeal lies in relatability, visual charisma, or viral content rather than expertise or depth. A case in point is the rise of TikTok personalities who command millions of followers despite lacking formal credentials in fields ranging from medicine to economics. Yet their opinions on complex issues, from climate change to vaccination, are often treated as authoritative by audiences seeking simplicity amid complexity. This phenomenon is supported by data showing that 63% of U.S. adults aged 18 to 34 trust online influencers more than traditional journalists or scientists for health-related information. Furthermore, the entertainment industry's monetization model incentivizes rapid content production over rigorous fact-checking or nuanced storytelling, leading to the proliferation of shallow narratives that prioritize virality over veracity. The consequences are clear. A generation raised on curated feeds may struggle to distinguish between credible expertise and performative authority, thus eroding the foundations of informed public debate and policymaking. Philosophically, this cultural shift resonates with theories of alienation and fragmentation articulated by thinkers like Karl Marx, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse. In modern capitalist societies, individuals experience a disconnection from both the products of their labor and from one another, resulting in a sense of rootlessness and purposelessness that cannot be resolved through consumption alone. This existential void is filled not by meaningful dialogue or community building, but by endless cycles of acquisition and comparison, what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, where identities are fluid, unstable, and perpetually reconstructed through consumption patterns. The decline of shared intellectual traditions, once anchored in universities, libraries, and public forums, is exacerbated by this atomization as people retreat into echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs rather than challenge them. For example, the erosion of common reference points in education, such as shared historical narratives or scientific literacy, leaves citizens less equipped to engage in civil discourse or understand global challenges like climate change or pandemics. Indeed, studies show that only 45% of Americans can correctly identify the difference between climate change and weather variability, a deficit that correlates strongly with lower levels of civic engagement and higher susceptibility to conspiracy theories. Despite these challenges, pathways exist for reversing these trends. First, structural reforms must prioritize education as a public good rather than a commodity. integrating critical pedagogy and interdisciplinary learning to cultivate curiosity, empathy, and ethical reasoning alongside technical skills. Second, media regulation and platform accountability should be strengthened to reduce algorithmic amplification of misinformation while promoting high-quality journalism and independent scholarship. Third, community-based initiatives such as participatory budgeting, local innovation labs, and intergenerational mentorship programs can help rebuild social trust and restore a sense of collective agency. Finally, policymakers must recognize that true resilience in the face of crises, from cancer research to climate adaptation, depends not just on technological innovation, but on cultivating a culture that values knowledge, collaboration, and long-term thinking over instant gratification and individual prestige. Without such efforts, the current trajectory risks entrenching a society where intellectual rigor is sacrificed at the altar of consumerist convenience, a future that would compromise not only our ability to solve pressing problems, but also the very fabric of human connection.
Section 6. Reimagining Intellectualism in the Neoliberal Era: Strategies, Initiatives, and Educational Imperatives. In an era dominated by neoliberal ideologies that prioritize market-driven values over intrinsic intellectual pursuits, reimagining intellectualism requires deliberate strategies to counteract the pervasive commodification of knowledge. One promising approach is the promotion of grassroots movements aimed at democratizing access to intellectual resources and fostering community-based learning environments. Such movements often operate outside traditional institutional frameworks, enabling participants to engage with ideas without the constraints imposed by profit-oriented systems. For instance, initiatives like neighborhood reading groups, public lecture series, and cooperative educational hubs have demonstrated success in cultivating spaces where intellectual curiosity thrives independently of economic incentives. Interdisciplinary approaches represent another critical avenue for bridging the gap between academia and broader society. By encouraging collaboration across fields such as science, humanities, social sciences, and technology, scholars can create dialogues that resonate with diverse audiences while addressing complex societal challenges. This integrative methodology not only enriches academic discourse, but also makes intellectual contributions more accessible and relevant to non-specialists. An exemplary case is the growing popularity of interdisciplinary conferences and publications that synthesize insights from multiple domains, thereby appealing to both expert and lay readerships. These efforts underscore the necessity of dismantling silos within academia to foster a culture of shared inquiry. Complementing these efforts are successful initiatives designed specifically to enhance accessibility to intellectual work. Open access journals, for example, have revolutionized scholarly communication by removing paywalls that historically restricted access to cutting-edge research. Platforms like PLOS1 and Archive exemplify how digital technologies can facilitate widespread dissemination of knowledge, empowering individuals worldwide to participate in global intellectual conversations. Similarly, community workshops organized by local libraries, universities, or nonprofit organizations provide hands-on opportunities for people to engage with scientific, artistic, and philosophical concepts in practical ways. These programs often emphasize experiential learning, making abstract ideas tangible and relatable. Central to revitalizing intellectualism is the cultivation of critical thinking skills across all levels of education. In a climate marked by misinformation and anti-intellectual sentiment, equipping students with the ability to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information becomes paramount. Educators must adopt pedagogical practices that prioritize inquiry-based learning, problem-solving exercises, and exposure to diverse perspectives. For example, incorporating debates, case studies, and real-world problem scenarios into curricula encourages learners to think critically about contemporary issues. Furthermore, fostering media literacy, understanding how information is produced,
disseminated, and consumed, is essential for navigating today's information-saturated landscape. Despite these advances, significant challenges remain. The entrenched influence of neoliberal policies continues to shape educational priorities, often marginalizing subjects perceived as less economically valuable. To address this, sustained advocacy is required from scholars, policymakers, and citizens alike. Collaboration among these stakeholders can yield transformative changes, such as increased funding for liberal arts programs, expanded support for open educational resources, and legislative measures promoting equitable access to quality education. Additionally, international cooperation may play a vital role in sharing best practices and scaling effective models globally. In conclusion, reimagining intellectualism in the age of neoliberalism demands multifaceted interventions that challenge existing paradigms and prioritize inclusivity, accessibility, and critical engagement. Grassroots movements, interdisciplinary collaborations, innovative educational models, and policy reforms collectively form the foundation for rebuilding a culture that esteems intellectual contributions. Scholars, educators, and policymakers must unite in their commitment to advancing these goals, ensuring that intellectualism remains a cornerstone of human progress and democratic resilience. Conclusion: addressing the roots of anti-intellectualism in the neoliberal era. The disappearance of intellectuals in the age of neoliberalism emerges as a multifaceted phenomenon shaped by intersecting economic, technological, and cultural forces. The roots of this decline lie in the systemic prioritization of market-driven values, where intellectual pursuits are commodified and undervalued unless they yield immediate measurable benefits. Neoliberal policies have dismantled the institutional frameworks, such as universities, research centers, and public media, that historically nurtured intellectual engagement, replacing them with profit-oriented models that marginalize critical inquiry. Simultaneously, the rise of digital platforms and algorithmic content delivery has exacerbated anti-intellectual sentiment, privileging sensationalism over nuance and fostering echo chambers that delegitimize expertise. Together, these factors have created an environment hostile to intellectualism where the pursuit of knowledge is subordinated to pragmatic, consumerist, and individualistic imperatives. Addressing the rise of anti-intellectualism necessitates a comprehensive strategy that tackles both macro-level structural issues and micro-level cultural dynamics. On the structural front, restoring public funding for higher education and research institutions is essential to counteract the commodification of knowledge. Policymakers must also regulate digital platforms to curb the spread of misinformation and prioritize evidence-based discourse over emotionally charged content. Ultimately, revitalizing intellectualism requires a collective reimagining of societal priorities, moving away from the neoliberal emphasis on utility and profitability toward a renewed appreciation for the intrinsic value of knowledge. Only through deliberate, coordinated efforts across sectors can we hope to reverse the tide of anti-intellectualism and ensure that intellectual pursuits continue to serve as a cornerstone of human progress and democratic resilience. Thanks for listening. See you next time on Global Blueprint.